Hi, everybody. So good to see you here in such a beautiful venue. I'm Vinson Cunningham, a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, and I'm here very happy to moderate this panel on public art and its uses, its many uses, especially though insofar as it helps us to promote inclusivity in cities and in places. So I'd like to introduce our panelists and get right to it. Mel Chin is a lauded conceptual visual artist whose work conjoins cross-cultural aesthetics with complex ideas. Unconventional and politically engaged, his projects are often insinuated into unlikely places and investigate how art can provoke greater social awareness and responsibility. As you just saw in the prior presentation, Chin was one of the participating artists in the Monument Lab's provocation with this interactive installation, To Me. Jessica Rowe joins us from Des Moines, Iowa, where she serves as director of the Greater Des Moines Public Art Foundation. She's worked to advance many public projects, collaborating with many notable artists, including Richard Serra, Bruce Nauman, and Mary Miss. Most recently, she advanced a major commission by Kerry James Marshall called A Monumental Journey. Rose DeSiano is an artist who uses sculpture and manipulated photography to examine the history within landscapes and our collective consciousness. She has completed a number of commissioned public sculptures and recently won the 2018 Uniqlo Parks Expression Grant for her unveiled photo sculpture called Absent Monuments in Rufus King Park in Jamaica, Queens. We will also soon be joined by Kenseth Armstead. He is held up in traffic, but soon he will zoom right up to the stage. He is a multimedia installation artist whose work has been exhibited in museums that include the Whitney, Guggenheim, and Studio Museum in Harlem. This past month, Kenseth unveiled an installation called Washington 2020, which surrounded the George Washington statue in Union Square, which is one of the public works that MAS restored and helps to preserve through its Adapt a Monument initiative. So without any other ado, I think we'll start with Rose, who will present for us some images of her work, and then everybody will do that and kind of give a presentation based on their images.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm excited to talk about this topic. It's something that I think about a lot. I don't know if I'm controlling this. That's definitely not my work. That is my work. So this is the Absent Monuments, which was just mentioned, which is currently in Rufus King Park. I am an artist that comes to sculpture through photography. And photography is really the root of everything that I've been working on in terms of my relationship to the history of landscape, the myths created by photography, the myths created by history. And public works and sculpture came about because I wanted photography to be taken out of the archives, which I work quite a bit with archives, both my own and New York City Public Archives, National Archives of Photography. I wanted the photographs to get out in a way to kind of re-inform the landscape and re-inform the people that occupy this landscape. So this work is a combination of archival photographs and my own photographs, which talk about the history of Queens, Rufus King, who also was Long Island at one point. It kind of changed its name, as you guys all know. And so I'm interested in both how the photographs inform the viewers, but then also how the viewers inform the work. And so I use a lot of reflective elements in my artwork. And the Absent Monuments really refers to the fact that we don't have monuments dedicated to the people. And I think one of the themes of today's conference is that. How do individuals shape the language and the dialogue of the city? And that's something that's really central to my work as well. So you're looking now at some close-ups, and you'll see there's images from New York City Public Archives, the suffragettes, and also a lot of my own imagery from reenactments, which is something that is another way that history gets played out in a mythical way in reality. And so that's what you're looking at here. Materials, also very important to me. They inform the photographs. So the blue and white tiles is because of Delft tiles. There's a huge Dutch influence in this area of Rufus King Park. And so that's something that's kind of seen throughout my work, using materials to change and manipulate the meaning of photographs. This is a work I did earlier in Randall's Island, which I'm sure everyone in the room knows is an interesting historical landscape of Robert Moses curiosity. And so I was interested in kind of bringing that back to life, and once again, working with my own imagery and also with archival imagery from the New York City Parks Department. So you'll see at the bottom and the top there, those are historical images from the New York City Parks Department Photo Archive. And so once again, bringing photographs out into three-dimensional form with the ability to make a photograph monumental, which is not really something that can happen in print formation, is really, really important to me because it creates a dialogue within the city and it informs and educates the viewer, which is something that I think is very central to my work and I think very important when you're dealing with public arts. This is the last piece I'll show you, which is not a public artwork, although it ended up being hung in the window of the gallery. It's up right now at NYU on Waverly and Broadway, and it's just 3 of a 6-piece panel. And what you're looking at is a piece that I'm doing in the gallery is bringing public works inside as opposed to bringing photographs outside. So I guess I kind of go back and forth. And it's documenting the monuments that are in New York City and around New York City and the dialogue that creates. And as a woman artist, I think I'd fail you all to not mention the fact that there's 5 monuments to women in New York City out of 160, I believe. If I have them numbers off, it's still an impressive number. So that's something I'm dealing with. What is the dialogue created by the monuments we do see in our everyday passing? Because public art really is about that, a casual encounter that becomes an impression in our minds and creates a dialogue. So that's it.
Thank you so much. Jessica? Oh.
Oh, that's my stuff.
Oh.
Well, just keep going.
Yeah, let's just, if we can go back to the first thing we saw, which was actually Jessica's, the first thing that we saw by accident with Rose. That'd be great.
They're working it.
There you go.
Let's try. Let's try. Let's see. Art,
That's fine.
It takes time and thought.
Okay.
Here we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not quite the order. Good afternoon or good morning. I just wanted to start with an African proverb. It says, quote, "Until the story is told by the lion, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." So primarily I'm here because of a project with Carrie James Marshall. This image is of Carrie in front of the piece called A Monumental Journey. These are slightly out of order, but this is the built project. It stands 30 feet high. It's to commemorate the founding of the National Bar Association, which took place in 1925 in Des Moines, Iowa. The work you're looking at is Carrie wanted to create a monument without using pattern or color that would be African. So he chose these drums called a talking drum. He sliced them in half and repositioned them one on top of the other, one precariously posed as if it's about to fall. And it's not only to represent the voice of African Americans, because this talking drum has this nuance of communication which simulates a voice, but also our legal system, which is balanced but not perfect. And this is your work, Rose, very nice. And I'm going. Okay, so I wanted to mention that this is an image of the initial site, and the concept of the piece of A Monumental Journey has not changed, but the material, the concept began in 2002, started by African-American attorneys who wanted to commemorate this event. There was a small plaque in a parking lot that commemorated this event, but wanted to really create it with substance. And so this 30-foot sculpture is along the Riverwalk in Des Moines. You can see Beaux-Arts buildings. The one on this side is the police station. And initially it was going to be constructed out of fiberglass, cast in an atelier on the West Coast. But over the course of the years where we came across a lot of bureaucratic and financial setbacks, the material changed. And when the Public Art Foundation started working with Cary, again, re-engaging him in 2014, 2015, the material changed from fiberglass to brick. And it was all locally constructed. And the masons, it was very difficult. The engineering was very complicated because it's a rounded surface that's also torqued. But brick, as many of you probably know, is the material that was used very often with the historical architecture of the United States. And the construction of it was generally by African Americans. So in building the United States, these great historic buildings, here he's building a monumental journey. I talked a little bit about the messiness of this history, of the history not only of Iowa, but the whole United States, and coming to terms with it. And here we have the lion speaking rather than the hunter speaking. And you know, Iowa's had this sort of remarkable history of pioneering civil rights, but it's also a state which only 3% of the population is African American. And in Des Moines, where this piece is, the population is much more concentrated, where there's only 60% rather than 90% of the state being white. In Des Moines, 60% is, and the African population, African American, is 10%. But it's still a state which has percentage, is number one in the United States for the highest percentage based upon population of incarceration of African Americans. So in coming to terms with this history, which in a time which is very problematic in many respects, this was a remarkable project to bring together the community. It was funded solely by private funding. It's on public space, and we can move forward, I think. Not in that direction, but that's okay. We'll skip it.
Okay.
So anyway, that's pretty much a summary of the piece, and I think it's quite exciting to think about how this conversation continues, and I think public art is a conversation. This particular work, by very contemporary, though it looks to the past, it continues that conversation. I read an article in the New York Times recently of Titus Caffer, who's a new MacArthur Genius Award, who said that monuments, like perhaps a monumental journey, is not another period in the conversation, but a comma for us to continue it.
Thank you so much. If we could go to Mel's slides, hopefully
That was one.
this can be our moment of triumph.
Actually, the other one. That you,
Yeah,
Let's try. Yeah.
there we go.
There we go. Okay. Cruelty of the past is the cruelty of the present, of now. And it's a period where privacy, your private lives can be exposed to an extreme degree. And this piece is dominance and affection. It is, and it's a commentary that expands into that reality. This is from Melrose
I'm just
Place.
hanging on. This is as high as the old boys club lets us get. Just enough to see the top of our heads.
Well, I'm through climbing. I just came to get my things.
Oh, no, don't tell me. You're not quitting again.
Watch me.
I will. From the top floor.
The monumental constructions of are not necessarily of stone and bronze. They can be something like commercial television. And that is became in the 90s an insertion point for what we call the Gala Committee that secretly inserted for 2 years concepts, political dynamic, and related to the characters on this soap opera. And the thing about collaboration, if you're going into different fields of discourse, is to understand it's not about how subversive we were to put where Rodney King was beaten, painted like David Hockney, or a Jasper Johns TV, or a mail bag for a disgruntled worker with an AK-47 magazine ad, or the total proof poster in the video that depicts the Murat building blown up like the vodka ads of the time. It is about saying how you enlarge the capacities of things within a given constraint. The funded project began in New Orleans, where it discovered 30 to 50% of the inner city childhood population poisoned with lead before the storm. And therefore, there's a monument, the monumentality or the massive nature of this kind of construction of injustice and cruelty there had to be responded by the very voices of children and parents nationwide. So now we have almost 500,000 fundreds with the fundred reserves in DC, and we're making another kind of inroad with policymakers to inform them, because we can only educate them with policies that could end the problem forever. Recently in Times Square was a 19th century looking thing with a Westworldian neck capacity that goes where no New Yorkers normally go. I don't think y'all go to Times Square, right? Well, it was very fortunate for Times Square Alliance and Microsoft and the no longer empty Queens Museum and all the partners that allowed us to engage in Times Square. But it was not for you New Yorkers, it was for the millions of tourists that come through to give them an access point in the well of LED lights, presentation about cult of celebrity and marketing, to do something out of a very different material, to be the introduction to something also different in the air, where the Unmoored was a project that still, you can probably still go see it, with your cell phone, which filled the 26-foot level, the projected level of an extreme inundation of Manhattan in the future. So in a way, the monuments of the future could be actually the ones that we create virtually and augmented, and therefore to extend not the answer. Sometimes monuments are the answer. The public art is the answer. And I think I really admire the great James Baldwin that just really broke it down and said, excavating the question that's buried within those answers are quite important. So the directive of these projects sometimes is the question, not to give it all away, to withhold so there is an appreciation, to allow the catalytic structure to be grasped and have a meaningful reason for grasping it, to stimulate desire again and imagination. Anyway, Boomba. Hey, Kenseth, what you doing, man? It's Boomba. Okay.
Good morning.
All right. Hey, good to see you.
I think this is not Kenseth's slide,
No,
but
it's not.
The slides have been
Well, it looks like your thing.
That's mine.
It's
This
Carrie.
is beautiful, though.
that's everything you would have seen. So now you're caught up. If you press it again,
It
maybe.
only goes one way, so just hope.
Hi, I'm Kenseth Armstead. I'm an artist. I make things, but I'm not usually late. So this is this is a work I did at Olana. It's the first public artwork that I did, and they told me that I would have an acre and it would look onto 250 acres. And this is America's oldest and largest earthwork. And it's the project for Frederick Church was to make nature more natural, which is weird enough to say. And so I made an odd architectural folly, which is this 50 foot by 50 foot by 25 foot upside down equilateral pyramid that's tarred and feathered in the center of it to hold the landscape together. And it doesn't go back, but the previous piece was a piece at Socrates Sculpture Park where I was able to make, I was able to make a scaled down version of one of the public housing projects behind the park. I actually have never said public housing project, I always say public housing. But because we call them these projects, I really wanted I make a portrait of where they live. And most of the projects that go in this Socrates Park are actually maintained and built by residents of the Astoria houses. So I made a 2/5 scale version of the housing beneath, right next to the park. And it's also the largest population in the area. But everything in the neighborhood refers to one another. Noguchi refers to Socrates, Socrates refers to PS1, PS1. But the biggest community in the neighborhood that actually maintains all of that is usually erased. So what I did was make them the most visible and put them in the center of the park and made it this really, once again, odd architectural folly, but was open. And they kept asking me, like, why would you do this? And I was like, well, what happens when you make a portrait of someone? And we would have this ongoing conversation. And also I became, I was born in Queens and I became an honorary public housing resident. So this is at Brick, which is in downtown Brooklyn, and this project is Masterwork, Slaves of New York. The first work that we'd seen was Heresy, Hearsay, and that was at Olana. The second work is Masterwork, Astoria Houses, Building 24. There are only 23 houses in Astoria Houses, and I built a 24th. And this is Masterwork, and some of the works in the Fartherland series are satirically called masterworks because they refer to things that masters did, people who are property owners and slave owners. This is the number of slaves represented in feathers that are in New York at the time of the American Revolution, and that's over 20,000. So we don't refer to New York as a slave state, but New York was a slave state. 1 in 10 people in 1776 was a slave in New York State. And George Washington was stationed here, and he had to retreat. And one could only wonder what would have happened if even half of those slaves had been free men and actually been able to fight for the freedoms that we were claiming we wanted at that time. We'll go forward a little bit. And so this is the work that's up currently in Union Square. Funnily enough, I just mentioned George Washington. I've done 10 years worth of work on the legacy of Africans in the American Revolution and became oddly a kind of expert on Africans' presence in the American Revolution. Most people don't know, but 20% of the American army in the Revolution was African. In 1781, 20% of George Washington's army was African. On the British side, 30% of the army is African. That's a lot of Africans. And when I was in school, I was born in the 60s, there was no conversation about Africans in the American Revolution whatsoever. All of the spycraft in the American Revolution, Africans. The core base is Africans, who no one took seriously. No one thought they could read. George Washington, by the end of the war, after 5 years of war, started taking Africans seriously. This work is Washington 2020, and this work refers to the 20,000 slaves that were in New York at the time when Washington was stationed here and had to retreat, the 20% of the American population that was enslaved Africans, and the 20% of Washington's army that was in the American Revolution. I always have this fear that I'll forget one of the 20s, and look, it just happened. So,
You got there, you got there.
yes, I also had a dream last night that I was going to be late, and that happened, and I'm never late for anything, so this is just really not. But so all of the colors in the piece are red, white, and blue, and I'm engaging George Washington directly. This is the oldest monument in the city's parks system, and essentially all of my work, history is my medium. I use different materials, but always history is the medium, and I essentially am making a new dish. It's still food, and history is like food in that, you can add different herbs and spices, but at the end, it becomes more interesting the more rich it gets, the more materials you add to it. It's still a meal. But I find that rice without salt or butter or pepper is just not as interesting, No. So I figured I would just get into the history game, and I've gotten into the history game. The other thing is that the substrate here is steel because steel is how we do it. That's the American way of vertical architecture. Without steel, we wouldn't have that infrastructure. So the Empire State, which is the epitome of this, is behind it, and that kind of detailed why it became steel. Once again, this piece is tar and feathered. All the colors are red, white, and blue from the Revolution. And then there are two signs, which you can't read here, one of which refers to the 20,000 that are the slaves in 1776. And on the other side is the 20% of the army that is African slaves at the end. And then both at the bottom note that 20% of the American population before and after the Revolution for the Rights of Man were enslaved Africans. And that's that.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.
One question that I have with respect to public art as a practice and something that you think about is, usually when we see art, it's on these walls, right? That kind of limits ownership to the artist. It's like, here, look at what I did, or look at what this person did. And so there's the direction is very one way. But in public art, part of the idea at least is that this sort of democratic ideal that yes, this comes from a singular imagination, but then it belongs to I mean, that's a public part of it. It belongs to the city. It belongs to the people. How do you think about that when you're thinking about placing a work or creating it in the first place? How does that affect your imagination, whether it be historical, something about the present? How do you think about the ownership of this mass of other people?
Immediately when the idea comes about, the Public Art Foundation, we form stakeholders. We reach out into the community and we bring the community. It's a community process. It's a conversation that we begin immediately. And also, I had some other images, but at the dedication, there's always a dedication. The dedication always involves the community, and at the dedication, the community is always speaking. So the ownership starts to transform from the Public Art Foundation into the community's hands until we get to the dedication. We also program the space as year after year, month after month, whenever available, so that it becomes really a greater sense of space, and you do take ownership.
Yeah.
Well, that's the gorgeous thing about public art, that it can be totally, you don't have to be known, actually, because it is the relationship with the public that actually completes the project itself. So it gives an opportunity. One of the things is history does have its weight and maybe encapsulates its definition into limited possibilities. And I think we're at a critical time in our sociological development when you're talking about shaping the city. I think it's, well, I myself, I say I got to shape up. You have to, I'm a terrible example. But I think you shape up in terms of our approach to redefining it and pushing those territories much farther and further than ever before, because there's an obligation. The terrifying realities outside of New York are here, and they've been here. And it's almost like how, as we're discussing these kind of constructions, how do they expand outside the parameters that we're defining within this city? You know, there's questions. I mean, it's terrible.
In 1989, an amazing artist came to my art school, and that artist was Mel Chin. So if you want to blame somebody, blame Mel. He taught me this game. No, just kidding. But no, that's where I started this love of history and making monumental work. But I think that for me, none of the work is mine. The work is part of the public, and when I made the piece in Socrates Sculpture Park, I made it so that it would molt and the feathers would fall off. And so over time, it would be less and less feathered, and they would escape. And what I thought was interesting is that people were collecting the feathers, not taking them home, they were bringing them back and making constructions. And this was interesting because at Olana, it was this sort of rarefied, sort of staged area. And in Socrates, I was a Queensboro native coming home, and they adopted the piece. At that point, they were remaking the piece on their own, and now that is a signature component of all my work, that the public that I'm around must own it. They must feel it is theirs. And I say to everyone, oh my God, you know, I'm so honored to be working in your living room. Thank you for letting me work near you. And I invite them in, and if they want, they can help me make it, or they can tell me, one of the richer experiences when people tell me that it's ugly or that they hate it. And then I let them do the work, and I was like, wow, you hate it? That's strong. And woo, that's exciting. You know, like I hate so few things. And when that happens, I get so excited because then I know that person is going to be the prophet for this piece. They'll protect the piece. And when you make work in public, no work in a public space will exist for more than 24 hours if it is not adopted by someone. And this is very clearly true of my work, where I make work that looks strong, but it's actually quite ephemeral. And so the person at Union Square was this woman, Marion, and she told me that it was hard. She said, your work is hard on the eyes. And we just had a long conversation about why it was hard on the eyes. And then she came around to the history of it all. And then the next day, I saw her proselytizing to everyone in the park, Marion, who said it was hard on the eyes, how this work was hard on the eyes, but... And that's where she took ownership. She was telling a whole other story, but you know, this is, but it was her story. And she connected to this piece. It wasn't mine anymore. Anyways, I'm done. Rose,
Very similar.
bring it home.
Bring it home.
Bring it
Well,
home, Rose.
I'll tie in two things. One, absolutely true. If it doesn't become owned by the public, then it becomes destroyed, quite physically.
Yeah.
I had someone, his name was Ken, and he in Rufus King Park, and he walked around telling everybody that they should pay attention to this because this was an obelisk and a monument built by a woman. That was very important to him. And she's like, this woman has been out there all summer. It wasn't all summer, but so I think it's very true. But to me, that's a great accomplishment. The other way that I've kind of responded to the work being owned by the public is actually through social media. At this point, I lie and say I planned it in all my grant applications, but my Randall's Island piece was Instagrammed up a wazoo, to use a not greatly academic term. And it was really interesting to see how excited people were to do two things. One, learn about their landscape, but then also photograph themselves in this piece, which does make ownership of it. So I think there is this important thing when an artist is thinking about how something is going to go into public space of how you can pass it on. Because it's not a gallery, it's not a white cube. You have to take those people into consideration. And then lastly, to tie on to what Mel said, obligation. We have an incredible obligation as public artists to, especially in this political climate, to make work that is informative, or at least I feel that way about my own work. And I think it's very challenging. Just because you also don't want to make aggressive public artwork because that doesn't go over well. And it's a very interesting time to try to do something that falls in the balance and then also consider aesthetics, right? You don't want to make something that's like too challenging visually. So I don't know if that kind of ties all of our concerns together, but.
Yeah. We have actually a question from the audience that just follows right on this, is that are you involved with any efforts beyond the sort of natural, the sort of social media or being in the same space as your work? Is there any kind of back-end work where you are seeing some like data on how people have engaged with it, or is there a sort of a feedback process that usually accompanies this, or is it just kind of anecdotal as you see how people interact?
Well, I have to produce
Right.
data to get funding also.
Right.
So we develop curriculum to go into the schools. We have an app using GPS to bring people through spaces so we can count, we do a count of how much it's downloaded, that type of statistics, and how many hits on social media, that type. But also, actively, we also commission artists. Part of the foundation's job is to get artists into the thinking so that, and just to change the conception or to expand the perception that great art is not just in galleries and museums, but it's in the infrastructure of our daily lives. And that's where I think people take ownership. It's in our parks, it's in the bridges, it's in the streets. And I think that can be very exciting because that is, the access is 24/7.
Are there other ways that people?
Rose and I did a project in Central Park where we had a day where we had to do public art for one day, and we both did quite aggressive installations for one day, and it was bananas. And just imagine being in Central Park at 5 a.m. and in my case, I had it installed the night before, and they had to put an armed guard in it because people wanted to live in it. So that's anecdotal, and as artists, we don't generally do a lot of data. I mean, obviously with Instagram and stuff, you get feedback and you get hits, but you don't get to slice and dice that data. But I think on that one day, I would say I talked to about 600 people personally, and I would say the same for Rose, and I could see them talking to her, come over to me, talk to the next person, and so this is a very unusual thing. The art world is a very closed, almost militarily closed. There's like civilians and soldiers, and so this case, we were just out there with civilians, and they don't know anything about the military. They don't know anything about our marching orders. They don't know anything about our language. They don't know anything about how we regiment ourselves and the ways we use language. And when you talk to 600 people, I mean, that's a data set. And if it went to 1,000, that'd be a very good data set. But for 600 people, when you have this conversation, they don't know more about where they are, and you realize that if you're successful as an artist in public space, in my opinion, there's more there. And that sounds very simple, but that's the hardest thing to get to, where there's more there. Or where by removing something, you add more to the experience of being there. So in that conversation, I think in that day, I don't know how you felt about it, but in that day, I felt like there was no way that there wasn't some meaningful conversation, mostly with people who lived around Central Park, about how they were situated in relationship to, in my case, Seneca Village and Hooverville, which most people didn't know were both communities, one that was planned and was African American wealthy, and the other which was a shanty town that lived in Central Park and had a life in Central Park. They didn't know these things. And in your case, where there was like a farming community that had been on that site, maybe, not all the people overlap. Some 1,000 people might have talked to us, and literally their lives are not able to readjust the picture that they had of Central Park. But I mean, that's as far as I can go with it.
My first piece was in Bryant Park in '84 as a public work. And Bryant Park at that time was an excellent place to engage in meet prostitutes and buy different variety of drugs. And so
Public stuff.
Yeah, public stuff. And I was building this piece on site, and what happened was I was very afraid of one person. It was a dealer that I saw gut somebody with his knife. And for every moment of my time working on this, I just tried to avoid him, and I was creating my art. Eventually one day, he said, "I got my eye on you." I said, "Oh, Lord, have mercy." And he says, "I got my eye on you because you think I sell drugs to make money?" And he used a lot of different language. He said, "No." He said, "I do it. I'm trying to get off of this planet." And he's a wreckage of a planet. This is '84. And he says, "I need to build a spaceship, and I think I found the man to build it." So, but what I'm suggesting is that data collection is one thing, but the interpersonal relationship you have, even in the process, that educates you about a deeper character that may be in what my perception of him as dangerous drug dealer. To open up the spectrum of our engagement in humanity is complex. And if we're looking at working on the public, how much these private ruminations that can be expressed or brought forward, and how I like to think of art as a catalytic structure that creates that platform for the languages that have not yet formed, Yeah. So anyway, I don't want to pontificate now, but I still plan to take a lot of drugs and read a lot of rocket science and get back to him and create something.
I think too the ability to meet artists, for the public to meet artists, to have access, as much as access to their work, access to them, is magical. In some ways, it demystifies the creative experience, but also I think it is tremendously meaningful no matter what your age. And the times when, and that's another aspect of engagement, is how, and some artists are easier to engage than others, but I think it has tremendous meaning. I do want to mention something about Monumental Journey. It was a very complicated project because we had to build it like a building. And because it was in the floodplain, still on the river, it's on the opposite side of the river, we had to tie in with a storm sewer, and we had to have every weld inspected. And Kerry James Marshall waived all his fees to allow us to meet that deadline. So it was a tremendous commitment on his part, and that sort of reverberated throughout the whole community. It's also these 12 African-American attorneys that were honored. They had their own stories, which were stories hidden, which then have come to light again, and they're incredibly inspirational, every single one. And one of the 12 was a woman who was practicing law when women did not have the right to vote. And just to think about that segregated time, how far we came. And when 1925, when that was founded, there were only 1,000 African-American attorneys in the United States. And that same year, the Ku Klux Klan was 50,000. So today, though, there are 65,000 African American attorneys in the United States, and it certainly has grown, and it's certainly an organization has done tremendous good. So it's truly something not just the community can be very proud of, but I think the nation can be very proud of.
This all goes to another question that I have, which is kind of, how do you think of the many purposes, the functions of public art? I mean, we talk a lot about, when we talk about the monumental, we talk a lot about the past, right? And entombing, enshrining, celebrating a kind of history. But there's also the sort of, the way in which art points the way toward a future, an imagined future. And then there's the way it comments on the present, right? I mean, we talk about a lot of the politics of today. How do you manage those sort of temporal associations of art?
I'd like to jump in that one because myth making has always been at the core of, especially coming from a photography background. Journalism, archives, the way they're curated send a specific message, and then that creates a future based on what may or may not have actually happened. And I think that's a lot of public art. So we're creating this dialogue in the city based on the monuments that exist that creates maybe something that's not truthful. And I think one of the things I wanted to bring up today, and it does dovetail into your question, is the temporary public arts, which I know the two of us engage in quite a bit, Mel as well, about how recontextualizing stuff that's already there, that goes future, right? So, you know, we have a great example of George Washington being recontextualized through the work. If we need that, otherwise we become stagnant, and we become inaccurately stagnant. So I think when moving to the future, the responsibility is to both create new monumental works that talk about what's important now, but also to continue to have this engagement with the stuff that is there, the artwork that is already up, and kind of change its meaning, because that's our obligation, I think. So I think all of us are engaged in that practice, which is very important right now.
1% of the population controls almost all the wealth of the world. And we're given, as public artists, sometimes a 1% of some kind of building commission. And yet we're looking at this public art as a question of, can it really do something? And when the world is being ultimately destroyed by complex economic, militaristic, conjoined forces, and here we are. So I want to resist to think about public art as the answer, just like the engineers were maybe the answer before. Now I think it's almost how public art can be conjoined with other disciplines of law and history and ideas and science in order to combat the reality that is there. It's not the Band-Aid effect, it is a Band-Aid because the wound is deep. The wound within our laws has been pointed out, you know, in Michelle Alexander's book. They're still in place. That is the struggle for justice that is in everybody's head. What has happened recently in D.C. with the Supreme Court and the woman who had to expose her, Ms. Ford, Dr. Ford, who exposed herself publicly and to be treated. And this is indicative of the reality we are facing. And I don't know if public art can respond to that, but we're willing, you know. And you got to be willing, and it's more an obligation. I think it's an opportunity. I don't know if you can make an obligation. I don't think you're hired to do these things. And it's almost like I'm not inspired by tragedy or these realities. You're compelled. You have to be compelled now these days to do anything in the light of the constructions that are so monumental, really, that we're facing.
Yeah.
I feel like, you know, in public space, the black body is constantly being removed. This is not just in one area, but it's sort of this American way of removing the black body. So all of my works are this chain of the black body being reconstituted and recoded and made central. The most valuable thing for me is the relationships that I built with the young men in Astoria houses in Socrates. They'd never seen a guy just show up with 2 tons of stainless steel and make a thing in the middle of the cultural space that they'd only been able to work for as a separate and outside entity. And there I was their body. This structure was their body. So we're in a church, apparently there's this notion of communion, and I think that that's a vital aspect of the science fiction of making public art, that you're recoding history at a base level. I sort of branded some programming at the Drawing Center Active Line. And for me, most of my things I consider to be drawing. So I'm making an active line that is a physical, actual line, not a metaphorical line, to their bodies. And in a time where standing on the wrong corner near a fancy coffee shop can get you arrested, my piece is there and they can stand next to my piece, and it's safety for them. It's safety for the black body. And this is another aspect, and maybe it's only my imagination, but I think that it does perform this act as well. And that's, the thing that keeps me going to the studio is knowing that I can act ethically to engage in justice. And this is one way that I do that, aside from making aesthetic statements.
Yeah. That leads, one of the audience questions, I think we got a couple more minutes, was, it kind of goes to this notion of space and safety, is that one of the associations that people have with art, because of the way we code art in terms of its economic function with regard to markets and its association with wealth, is that people often associate public art with gentrification, with erasure, with the sort of a loss of something. How do you interact with that notion? How do you combat that notion to the extent it needs to be combated? How can you be an artist who, on some level, beautifies space when sometimes even beautification has these negative sociological associations?
I think I'm speaking for myself, but that is part of the challenge of being an artist at all, and definitely being a public artist, is that you kind of have to take your lumps for your greater interests. And so I've definitely been accused of making something pretty that shouldn't be pretty, or putting work where I have no right putting work. That's definitely dialogues that have happened with the community. I think when we talk about the community in a public setting, we tend to only highlight the positives, but there is friction, even when you're doing your best and you're doing good for others. And I think I have to think about how my work does have value in that community, or does have value in the contemporary dialogue. And if a handful of people have something negative to say to me about that, that's kind of part of the job, And I think that's, if you start to internalize every criticism, we end up with the government we have. So I think you need to kind of move forward regardless.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sometimes it's better than apathy.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
When I was in Flint, I went to Flint to do a project, and it was way after a lot of things had happened, and of course, the funded project is trying to stop childhood lead poisoning. So before you get there, you gather, I had 20 different citizen group leaders meet me, and so I can introduce a project called Flint Fit. And the first engagement is essentially when you gather people who have been under such a crisis, they just looked at me and said, okay, they said, look, Hillary's been here, Trump's been here, Obama's been here, Janae Monell's been here, maybe that Brad Pitt's been here, but we still don't have any clean drinking water. So what the hell can you do as an artist? What the hell can you do to give us some kind of reason to invite you into our community one more time, and figure out how your exploitation can make you greater? Exploitation of us can make you greater. Because we know how it goes, and we're being forgotten, and we still don't have clean drinking water. And at that time, luckily, I come in with an idea, and I just said, look, I want to pay you to collect these bottles and put them in this truck to take down to North Carolina, where they'll turn it into fabric, but the same people make it for Patagonia, because I'm talking to Tracy Reese, who will turn it to rainwear, swimwear designs, and we're going to sew them up back in Flint and have a fashion show in New York. Is that okay? And we did that. But that's the limitation of the art. It's now we're back in Flint now to follow up that, which is not my field, which is create a business plan for the Flint Fit brand to be owned by those very people that questioned the project to begin with. So what I'm saying is that the dealing with the communities, if you are going to be engaged, you approach things with an evolutionary context that is informed by the very people you're engaging with.
As is obvious here, we could go on for many more minutes, but this is the end of our time. Thank you so much. We had so many more questions and everything, but thank you so much. Thank you all so much for talking to us.
Thank you, man.
Appreciate it.